Hello everyone, I'm New Zealanchi. People say to me you are Japanophile, Otaku, Weeboo, Japanese, but whatever you call me, I'm New Zealanchi. Please remember me. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the North Korean abduction issue.
So a while back, we talked about Tojoboos, these sort of weeaboos who start to simp for Imperial Japan in the Second World War. And I thought it was worth taking another look, at the weird Tojoboo YouTube channel I found when researching this stuff. So what we're going to do today is just generally talk about like the sanitization of Japan's politics in like a contemporary sense. Also, how the knowledge about Japan's role in World War II often gets obscured by its own government because it's a war it hasn't really apologized for. And then we're just going to discuss Tojoboo arguments and I guess, is there like a weeaboo to Tojoboo pipeline? I'm going to plug my social media for about a minute, so skip that if you're not interested. But before we get any further, a lot of my work on this channel is demonetized because when you're covering more serious, sometimes edgier topics, YouTube doesn't like this. So if you've ever enjoyed my work, please consider becoming a patron. And you don't have to pledge a crazy amount. I want to build up my Patreon based on as many people as possible, pledging little amounts like $1 or $2. So if you feel like I have ever brought anything that's worthwhile into your life and my content, please really consider becoming a patron to help me continue to do this regardless of if YouTube monetize or not most of my videos in a given month. Also, if you want to join our communities, come check out our Discord and my subreddit. Those links in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, please check out the Kavernacle at Twitter, at Instagram, and also my personal Reddit where you can keep up to date with all my content and what I'm doing. Thanks so much for the 35k. It feels good to finally hit it. For every 5k we get a new chocolate orange, so help me build the pyramid further. On a normal week, so not this week or next week, I stream 2 times a week on a Thursday and a Tuesday, and I archive the streams on the Kavernacle Extra, so check that out if you care about any of that stuff. So otakus and weeaboos don't necessarily have to be something like really sinister, but I've always been uncomfortable with how much this relationship with sometimes Japanese art and culture can translate to broader views about Japan in general. So like anime from Japan is extremely popular. One of the most popular cartoons you can find even in the West. It's this global phenomenon. So many people love anime and it's a great cultural export for Japan and it's good for Japan's soft power. And as a relatively small country compared to somewhere like the US and compared to the US's like entertainment industry, the soft power of Japan is really only rivaled by a few other countries. I'd say maybe, Britain and America being 2, which probably surpass it. But Japan's cultural exchange with, the West goes back hundreds of years. You have things like gunboat diplomacy from the US's side, opening up this Japanese market by force. You have, migrant workers going to the US to work. And of course, you have a ton of anti-Asian racism directed at Koreans, Japanese, and Chinese workers who went to the US to work. You also have the exchange of wars between these countries, and the US obviously having a massive war with Japan during the Second World War, and that led to the occupation of Japan by US military forces who also, with other allies, designed Japan's new government and constitution to make it like this Western-style democracy, but the caveat being they did not have a military, just a self-defense force. A side effect of the war is Japanese culture became more, embedded in US culture. You had people who had an experience of Japan from living there, often even fathering children with Japanese women, sometimes prostitutes. And then you had a new US ally. This country that hadn't been that close to the US was now key to their anti-communist strategy in Asia. And then you have, obviously, Kurosawa films that helped make these mythical samurais from Japan even more popular in Western culture. And then from there, it just, their cultural exports just get more and more popular. And that includes technology as well. Japanese cars, Japanese motorbikes, Japanese television. And then in the 1980s, you start to get the best video game systems from Japan. And that continues to the 1990s with Nintendo and PlayStation. And obviously in this period is when you see the first animes going to America. And the 1990s sees this massive wave of dubbed animes. Cartoons originally filmed with Japanese dialogue suddenly have English dialogue and are more accessible, gaining lots of fans. As a kid who grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, I watched anime. I watched dubbed Pokemon, dubbed Beyblade, dubbed Yu-Gi-Oh! And I really like this stuff. My brothers even watched, I think it was called Duel Masters. So it became, quite a popular staple in my childhood. And Pokemon is like one of the most valuable properties on the planet, of course, created in Japan as well. And Japan's economy and cultural exports were doing so well in the 1980s that this is what led to a lot of xenophobia about Japan supposedly taking over the world. And a stereotype that still exists to this day is that Asian corporations are always tools of the state they're from. So you have it with Korean corporations, you have it with Japanese corporations in the 80s, and now you have it with Chinese corporations, where often Westerners view these companies as no better as an arm of the country that it comes from. And this isn't unique to the fear-mongering about China, this happened with Japan. And you have pictures of Republican congressmen smashing Japanese TVs with hammers on the steps of Congress and stuff. So they really feared Japan were going to take over the world, and this informs the landscape of a film like the original Blade Runner and just a cyberpunk aesthetic in general, which again has a lot of Japanese elements in it, even though it's pretty problematic. I've made a video on that. So it's not hard to see why people become, sort of obsessed with Japanese stuff, because it's become such a part of Western life these days, thanks to the history I have just outlined. But again, often as a cultural export, it does lead people to have problematic views on things like women, especially Asian women, which goes back, like I was saying, to the US occupation, but even further to the British colonialism in Asia. And it often leads to, unhelpful racial stereotypes about Asian men as well. So there are problematic aspects about being a weeaboo. But now let's get into, is there a weeb to Tojoboo pipeline? And we're going to get into Tojoboo arguments. So Hideki Tojo was the Prime Minister of Japan during the Second World War, so he led this militaristic fascist nation. He also served in various military positions during the First and Second Sino-Japanese War and just general Japanese imperialism in the region. Of course, the Japanese were very famous for their militaristic code, which, harken back to things like the samurai. You had things like, seppuku, you had banzai charges, and you had these really fanatical soldiers who would inspire terror in the Western aligned forces because it seemed like they didn't care if they lived or died. Now, part of being a Tojoboo is admiring the Japanese soldiers for their supposed courage in warfare and this suicidal tactics they are often made to employ by the higher-ups. So I want to show you the Tojoboo YouTube channel I showed you guys in the other Tojoboo video. Now nearly has 7k subs. And basically what he usually does is just, far-right nationalist propaganda for Japan. But he has one video talking about the Peleliu campaign in 1944 that the Americans staged on the Japanese occupation there. Just want to play it for you quick.
The local commander who took command was Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. The commander of the 2nd Infantry Regiment led a garrison of about 10,500 soldiers. The residents of Peleliu offered to fight alongside the Japanese, but Colonel Nakagawa uttered a harsh rebuke to the residents. The Japanese Imperial Army will not lower itself to fight alongside the savages like you. The residents were so upset because they thought not only were the Japanese soldiers their friends but also their comrades. They felt betrayed by Colonel Nakagawa, and they decided to leave the island. A few days after, all the residents got on board a ship organised by the Japanese army to evacuate them to the main island. The evacuation ship was leaving the pier. While leaving, the residents were looking back at their home island, being filled with sadness. All of a sudden they heard someone yelling on the pier. It was the Japanese soldiers that had been hiding until now, and they were waving to the residents. The soldiers waved their hands and yelled to the residents, "Live well! See you again!" Among the soldiers, they saw Colonel Nakagawa with a big smile. Then the residents understand that Nakagawa acted very rudely to make the residents want to evacuate. The residents learned later the reason for Colonel Nakagawa's words and true intentions to save them, and they shed tears. On April 22nd, 1947, about 2 years after the end of the war, Pacific Fleet Commander-in-Chief C.W. Nimitz praised the Japanese fighting spirit with the following words: "Tourists from every country that visit this island should be told how courageous and patriotic were the Japanese soldiers who all died defending this island."
So in that video, he talks about, that they saw the natives there as lesser than them, as savages, but he tries to rehabilitate it and says this general actually did it for their own good, and he actually did like them. But that's probably not how he viewed them. The Japanese were racial supremacists in this period. And then he, talks about the US general who admired, their fighting skill and stuff. And he basically tries to rehabilitate the Japanese war effort as something like noble, kind of admitting that these guys were racial supremacists who subjugated loads of Asian native peoples, of course also the Chinese and the Koreans, and believed they were racially superior to these guys and they were doing it to expand their empire. But this is symptomatic of the Tojoboo argument in general. But if you're a Tojoboo, why would you think in this way? Surely if you grow up in the West, this guy's from New Zealand who fought in the war against Japan, surely you know about the atrocities, surely you know about the war crimes, surely you know about the Japanese brutality. Now, if you're a Tojoboo and you're totally obsessed with Japanese culture and you're really doing a deep dive into Japanese politics perhaps, Japan has a massive problem which has led to real tensions with its neighbours, that it hasn't really acknowledged how bad the war was from their own side. This is a problem that has been going on for years. It's still a massive sticking point in Korean, South Korean, Japanese relations, of course, Chinese, Japanese relations, and North Korean, Japanese relations. And the sentiment generally is in the region is that Japan never really had to apologize because of the geopolitical ramifications. So, for example, of course, Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of China just after the Second World War. And, Japan gave Taiwan back to China, and that is somewhere that Chiang Kai-shek fled to after the war to set up, Taiwan and the Taiwanese government there. But because China became communist and became an enemy of the West, the Americans don't really care about the Japanese apologizing for anything. They didn't even care when Chiang Kai-shek was in charge because they just saw these two countries as new allies against communism. When Mao was in charge, they didn't really care about these atrocities. And actually, Mao didn't really talk about it either, because Mao fought the century of humiliation, as it became to be known, between the 1840s and the Opium War and the revolution, which was successful, is the century of humiliation for China, which wasn't worth talking about anymore because China was on the path to, retake its great place, this Middle Kingdom. It was only when Deng Xiaoping came in for nationalist propaganda, he started talking about the Japanese war crimes again in China and how they'd never basically apologized. But even in Japanese textbooks, they don't talk about Nanking, they don't talk about comfort women. There is actually a movement from the government to remove this stuff, and Japan's government has only got more right-wing as time has gone on, and it's actually been controlled by one party for about 60 of the 75 post-war years. And Shinzo Abe was the old prime minister, but his granddad was a prime minister in the 1950s who was actually going to be charged as a war criminal for how he did genocide in Manchuria and worked Manchurians to death and took them back to Japan and worked them to death there as well. But he was let off by the Americans to be this anti-communist politician. But still today, with the nationalism of Japan, they do not recognize a lot of these war crimes. Also because the Allies didn't punish the emperor, it was easy to see him as not doing anything wrong because he got to stay in power for like another 30 years after the war, as long as he renounced like being this god. But of course the war was something the emperor wanted as well. Because of the Americans feeling the need to keep the Japanese on their side and use them as this anti-communist pawn, the Japanese never really had to apologize. The Americans didn't make them do it. It's not like Germany where they forced the kids to learn about all the awful stuff the Nazis did. Japan got to largely control how children were educated about the war. That's why I think if you're a weeaboo, it can be sort of dangerous because you might buy into this revisionist history, because Japan still depicts their history in a certain way, which can lead to Tojoboos believing this stuff. And this guy also tries to debunk stuff about Korean comfort women, so take a look at this video.
Comfort women were paid prostitutes. They were paid about 100 yen each time for their services, which was quite a lot back then. This is an official US report, by the way, on the comfort woman. Also, among other claims, is the forced labor by Japanese soldiers. This is not the case. The labor was not forced and they were paid. There are some photos that were submitted to the UN that was supposed to be proof of forced labor, but here is the Japanese workers. Another claim is that forced workers were treated poorly, but no, again they were paid and they stayed in good hotel-like facilities, had access to lots of different things they could do, for example, onsen.
So even if those documents were totally true and Korean workers and prostitutes were paid, it doesn't really make it any better. And I'm seriously doubting the legitimacy of that stuff, because we have numerous groups who were paid throughout history that were still essentially slaves. So obviously real slaves in America, African Americans, sometimes, rarely, were paid for their work. They were still slaves. Then you have stuff like Chinese slavery in South Africa by the British Empire, getting this massive workforce to come work for you in Africa. These guys were kept in camps, essentially were slaves. Just because they were paid doesn't mean anything else. And there's testimony by hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of women, of being these sex slaves to the Japanese Empire. So it's pretty disgusting this guy's trying to debunk it, but he is basically doing the work and carrying water for nationalists in Japan. And this strain of nationalism is pretty popular in Japan. It's not just relegated to the fringes. So I want to show you two more videos from this guy. First of all, to show you how his nationalist politics have really led him to be a Tojoboo. So he made a video talking about the Kawasaki bylaw. And basically, I'm going to read you what that law was, and then you're going to have a look at his videos. So Kawasaki enacts Japan's first bill punishing hate speech. Kawasaki on Thursday, this is in 2019, passed an ordinance against hate speech, and in the first in Japan, violators can be given criminal penalties. The new ordinance enacted at the Kawasaki Municipal Assembly, which will enter force on July 1st, bans discriminatory language and actions against foreign people in public spaces in the city. It makes repeat violations punishable by a fine of up to 500,000 yen. While Japan enacted a law designed to deter hate speech in 2016, the city concluded that the law has been ineffective in eradicating discrimination against ethnic minorities, as it lacks provisions to ban or punish the use of discriminatory language. Kawasaki, home to one of the largest Korean communities in the Greater Tokyo area, seeks to effectively fight discrimination with the ordinance by giving specific examples of what it's trying to stamp out. Actions specified include calling for minorities to be expelled for where they live, encouraging physical attacks against them, and referring to them as something other than human. Kawasaki Mayor Norihiko Fukuda first indicated in June that the city would introduce criminal punishments in order to strengthen measures to rein in hate speech. Hate speech targeting ethnic minorities in Japan has included threats to kill people of certain nationalities and severe insults and remarks. So generally a pretty positive thing. What do you think Tojoboo has to say about this stuff, especially when he's, carrying water for Japanese nationalists about Korea?
It's called bylaw to prevent discrimination and protect human rights of people living in Kawasaki City. What a nice bylaw. No one can oppose to protect their human rights. What's wrong with it? Good question. The bylaw stipulates hate speech against foreigners is criminalized with a maximum fine of up to 500,000 yen. Hate speech against foreigners? What about hate speech against Japanese? That's right. This bylaw can be interpreted that foreigners can make hate speech against Japanese, but Japanese cannot make any hate speech against foreigners. This is obviously discrimination against Japanese people, isn't it? Why do we need this new bylaw?
to prohibit hate speech while the existing law is applicable? This is the point. Certain groups of people in Japan have an ideology to suppress Japanese people in the region and then spread it throughout Japan. This bylaw upset Japanese people. Those who have an ideology want to make a division in society to weaken the rights of the Japanese people. By creating this bylaw, it makes it possible to overwrite or nullify the existing law.
So basically he's saying this law like undermines Japaneseness and saying doesn't outlaw discrimination against Japanese people. And he's basically saying it's making these guys protected from legitimate criticism from Japanese people. Generally pretty disgusting to frame a bill that pushes for more equality in this way, but really shows you how these Tojoboos really align with nationalist Japanese and how they view the world in the same way they do. Because protecting ethnic minorities is a good thing. Protecting them from discrimination is a good thing. It says the law hasn't worked here, so that's why they introduced it, and it feels like it's a rare thing in Japan as well. Now, to take one more argument, which is more common with Tojoboos, and I'll tie it back to World War II. So he has a video called Yellow Peril, and he talks about a lot of arguments I've seen in other places. It's the more common Tojoboo thing I've seen. Basically talking about the reasons why the West hated Japan in World War II, and the reason they had to fight World War II.
Yellow peril is a racist color metaphor that is integral to the xenophobic aspect of colonialism. Yellow peril started in the European nations, which resulted in them to stop supplying natural resources to Japan. This is the reason why Japan needed natural resources to shift to the USA. The US also stopped supplying natural resources to Japan for the same reason, the late arrival of yellow peril. The population of Japanese increased rapidly during the time when the natural resources were imported from the Europe and the US. At that time, Japan definitely needed to have imported products to maintain the increased population in the nation of Japan. The US pushed Japan to move Asian nations to search for natural resources to preserve the Japanese people in Japan for the future that white-powered colonization nations are waiting for. This is why Japan was put in a position to go to war by the US, all because of their racial discrimination. Japan is the very first nation in Asia who industrialized and organized by learning the Western-style industrialization. Western nations had no mind to have mutual prosperity with the colored nations, which is obvious looking at their colonialism. They feared Japan. They feared Japan. They believed that colored people would dominate the whole world and white people would be controlled by colored people.
So you've seen that there, and like I said, the reason a lot of these guys say is that America hated Japan mainly because of racism, and it did the oil embargo against Japan mainly because of racism. Now, I'm not going to deny, and I've outlined the video, America is insanely and was insanely racist against Asian people. That is a total fact. Japan kept conquering places, and the oil was being used for their war machine, which also threatened US interests in places like the Philippines, which is essentially a US colony. So they weren't going to keep giving oil to this fascist empire to continue to conquer the region. And he's framing it as that the Japanese were pro-Asian equality and they were uniting Asian people. And if you know anything about the history, this is largely a facade, because while some Asian communities did celebrate the Japanese kicking like the British and Americans out of certain places, they quickly realised these Japanese did not view them equally and weren't going to help them and were just as bad. So it basically makes it seem like World War II was actually the fault of America and Pearl Harbor was deserved by America for no longer selling oil to this massive empire and massive war machine, is what these guys are saying, and it's because of racism in their mind. And what it's doing is taking a legit thing, which America undoubtedly had. And America still has a problem with this yellow peril stuff. But in the context of Pearl Harbor and the oil embargo, like, it does make sense from like an international relations point of view that you're not going to sell the lifeblood of a war machine which is slowly taking over Asia and threatening your own territory, you're not going to continue to do that. So I'm just going to read some Tojoboo arguments I found around the internet. So a Reddit post saying, the Empire of Japan killed as many as 250,000 Chinese civilians because they helped 67 American bomber crew escape. Someone says, I was watching World War II in colour last night, and I'd never known why the Japanese attacked the US. It turns out that they helped the British in Asia during World War I, and they tried to negotiate with Western powers after the war to allow Japanese people to immigrate to Western countries. They were shot down by everyone, and then the American president instituted a whites-only legal immigration plan. I'd imagine that royally pissed off the Japanese, and when the Americans moved their enormous naval fleet to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese feared that they were the next ones to be conquered. As they looked around the Pacific to see the Dutch, French, British, and American imperialists had full control of vast swathes of land that they acquired through conquest. So again, this doesn't make any sense. It's basically framing it as poor Japan was so racially discriminated against that the only thing they could do was, I don't know, conquer Korea, take massive parts of China, conquer loads of parts of Asia. Remember, Japan was conquering Asia before World War II. The first Sino-Japanese War was in 1895. The second was in 1937. They didn't turn around and think, we're next from the Americans. They thought, we want a European-style empire like all the Europeans have in Africa and the Middle East. And in the late 1800s, they changed their constitution. They tried to make themselves more like a Western-style military power, basing it on Prussia and Britain. And they were conquering territory from this period. So no, Japan wasn't weak. And while it probably did have grievances with the US for being so racist towards them, you can't make that the whole argument about why they did brutal imperialism around the rest of Asia. You just have some other ones, like here's another one. Japan wasn't a country that existed simply because of racism. Japan wasn't a country that promoted a racist agenda and committed genocide that, like Germany was. That is why those flags are associated with hate, and the Imperial Japanese flag is not. Again, this is like some Tojoboo. Of course, the Japanese promoted a racist agenda and they committed genocide. It's well documented. Another one saying that Japan doesn't commit atrocities. Japan never developed or carried any plan for extermination of certain populations. In whole or in part, Japanese soldiers killed a lot of people, no doubt about it, but they did so in incidents of indiscriminate violence not authorised by the Japanese government. Again, that is a total lie and fabrication. But it's a weird use of racism to justify Japan's own racist, fascist agenda. Two things can be true at once. America did not like Asian people. The League of Nations did not like Asian countries. They didn't want freedom for Asian countries. They didn't like the Japanese. They thought Asians and Japanese people were racially inferior. That is totally true. They did that. Japan was also growing its empire massively throughout the 1900s, and with people like Tojo in charge, they believed in this fascist racial supremacy where they carried out genocide, conquest, of their own accord. They didn't need the Americans to motivate them. They'd been planning this for decades and decades, and it's what they wanted to do. It's not because they felt like racially abused, they just wanted this empire. So it's clear there is a Weeaboo to Tojoboo pipeline, but I think very specific things have to happen. So I think you have to be some sort of weeb who is totally obsessed with Japan. But then I also think you have to be a weeb who maybe is way more into the history side, and then you actually buy into the nationalists, and I'm not talking about a minority, I'm talking about the mainstream nationalists in Japan, who write this revisionist history of the war, and then you believe them. So you believe the Japanese government, for example. You believe the official textbooks in many Japanese territories, which downplay how bad the war was, omit certain things like Nanking and Comfort Women. You believe in all that stuff. And then maybe you take that to another extreme where you think because of the massive racism from European colonialists in this period, Orientalism, Yellow Peril, all that stuff, that Japan actually fought this war and fought their wars in Asia to unite Asia against the Europeans. And they also did it because they had massive grievances and the US wasn't treating them fairly, like with the oil embargo, because the US was racist against them. And it's the racism which spurred them on, and their war was actually just against the European colonialists, and they didn't do it for their own colonial power, and basically thinking they are this master race in Asia as well. So there is definitely a path there, and if you watch some of my other work, you will see how this sort of works. But I guess even general weebs, as much as being a weeb can lead to very problematic, views on women, and views on Asian men as well, and just Asian culture in general, I don't think it's as common to get from Weeaboo to Tojoboo. I think Tojoboo are actually one of the smaller boo categories compared to like Veraboos or Roadie-boos. I think are a lot more popular than a Tojoboo, but no doubt because of Weeaboo culture and the popularity of Japan's culture in the West, that this stuff can sometimes exist, as this YouTube channel proves. Anyway, let me know what you guys think down in the comments. If you want to follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter and on Instagram. If you want to join our communities, Discord and subreddit in the description as well. And if you want to support my work, check out my Patreon. And if you made it this far, thank you all for watching.